Hi, everybody. This is another poem on our list of poems called Dulce et Decorum Est, which is a Latin phrase, and I will talk about that in some of the next slides. The author is Wilfred Owen. The date of writing is 1918, right at the end of World War I. And if you've read it already, it is a World War I poem. There's an interesting diagram here, which is the handwriting of Wilfred Owen as he actually worked on the poem. And it's an interesting look at how writers work in their own hand. Not sure a lot of writers still work by hand. Some do for sure, but a lot type now. He was actually writing this poem as he was on the battlefront in the trenches of World War I. Here's the poem Dulce et Decorum Est. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of disappointed shells that dropped behind. Gas, gas, quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim, through the misty panes and thick green light as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you two could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear, at every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. The title of the poem means in Latin, it is sweet and proper to die for one's country. And of course, at the end, we find out that that is a lie, according to Wilfred Owen, and according to most people who fought in World War I and all wars. But the idea of the poem is to ironically mention the phrase, and I'll talk about that later. This poem is a four-stanza poem, rhymed and rhythmic, with differing numbers of lines per stanza. The speaker is Wilfred Owen himself, a soldier in World War I, who witnesses a man drown in a sea of green mustard gas when all other soldiers were able to fit their gas masks on in time. Before this horrible sight, he writes about the wartime conditions soldiers must endure. And at the end, he speaks to the audience, asking us if we think it is still acceptable to glorify war after reading about what realistically happens. There is some punctuation that stands out. The ellipses in line 12, as well as the dash in line 24. Also, the exclamation marks and dash in line 9, which show the horror and terror almost in real time as we're reading it. So these are things that we stop and pause and look at and think about as we're looking at the technique and the format. To the left is a picture of Wilfred Owen. Unfortunately, he died just a week or two before the war ended during battle. He wrote all his poetry on the battlefield, sent it home, and it was published after his death. He's considered one of the top two writers of World War I poetry. There was actually a group of British World War I poets. He was part of that group. And because of this group's poems, this poem and others, people started looking at and thinking about war in an entirely different way. And just like some of the other texts that we've read, such as The Yellow Wallpaper, A Raisin in the Sun, they bring up issues in reality that people had thought about differently before. And they wind up teaching us something and perhaps even changing lives, changing culture, changing social attitudes. So in stanza 1, what is the condition of the men as described in stanza 1? They're like old beggars. It shows that they're in a bad state. They're old beyond their years. Um, they're bent over, knock-kneed. Um, they're weighed down by the backpacks that they're having to carry that are so filled with the necessary supplies. Coughing like hags again shows that they've been aged. A hag is an old person, generally an old lady. But in this case, I think it's just meant to signify how old they feel and sound. Knock-kneed, we have hard sounds. It shows how they walk in fear and coldness. Coughing, cursed. Men marched, imitates the sound of boots. Distant rest. We have lots of alliteration and consonants that are very hard sounds. There's nothing beautiful, melodious, or pretty about the words that he chooses, and that's purposeful, of course, because this is a poem about the horrors of war. The bass seems really far away. They're exhausted, they're weary. What happens to the speaker and another soldier in stanza 2? What takes the men by surprise? A gas shell falls into the trench. They're all shouting in panic. It creates a sense of urgency and fear. And the clumsy helmets that they have to put on are the gas masks themselves. In this verse, there are a lot of ing words. Ing. It therefore feels like it's happening right before your eyes in that moment. It creates urgency and suspense. It's a matter of life and death. Instead of the past tense, it's the present participle. And that always creates a feeling of being in the moment. What effect does the word but have in stanza 2? Of course, the fear that someone has not been successful in putting on his mask. What is the gas compared to in this verse also? Green sea. And of course, I think that's an irony in this instance, because normally if we think of a green sea, say we're on a beach in the Caribbean and we're thinking about the green sea, it's beautiful, peaceful, and lovely. But here in this context, the green sea is terror-inducing, a mode of death. He drowns because the gas fills up his lungs and he's unable to breathe. So stanza 3 is the short 2-line long stanza. And what happens here to the speaker? We sort of take a step forward into the future of the speaker, of Owen himself. It relates to the effect this death has on the speaker. The dead man plunges at him. The soldier does this almost instinctually. He doesn't want to die. And it's almost like he's thinking in his head, somebody please help me. Owen's not going to take off his helmet, though, because the helmet can only fit one person. Thus, Owen winds up feeling guilt, even though he has nothing to be guilty of. That is the horror-inducing thing about war and what's going to haunt him forever in his dreams. He's helpless to assist his friend. It's basically PTSD with the nightmares he has. If you think about it, he probably felt a mixture of emotions during this experience. Horror, fear, empathy, as well as, unfortunately, relief that it was not him that died, that it was someone else. That's the sad part of all of this, too, is the effect not only that it has on the man who died in such a horrible way, but on the people surrounding the man who died. Stanza 4, what happens here? Owen then gruesomely describes how he has to throw the man into the back of a wagon with a simile. The man's hanging face like a devil's sick of sin. So how can the devil ever be sick of sin? Because the devil represents sin. He loves sin. So to have achieved the moment when the devil becomes sick of sin suggests that this is the greatest evil, an unimaginable hell, an evil that's even beyond the devil's comfort zone. Here in this last stanza, he also brings in an audience, you. There are two uses of you in this poem, and that is the public, like us, who are reading the poem after publication, or historically and biographically, a journalist who wrote loving propaganda about war, encouraging men to join. And Owen was actually writing this to a woman, that very woman called Jessie Pope. So this poem was his response to her. Propaganda showed up again in World War II also. Once Hitler rose onto the scene and Mussolini, people didn't forget necessarily the horrors of World War I, but the way the world was culturally and societally at the time, that propaganda re-entered the scene. Regardless of what happened with World War I, still people knew the gruesomeness that was about to happen. And of course, after World War I, mustard gas was banned. It was made illegal. The alliteration in this stanza, too, serves to draw the attention of the reader, such as watch the white eyes writhing in his face. We hear the filling of the lungs with fluid. Imagery, not only here, but in the entire poem, gives us the impression of war's horror. The sounds, the sights, the tastes, the textures. All of that comes through in this poem. So final lines and final thoughts. The last two lines of the poem. The adage, it is sweet and right to die for your country, is a lie. Government lies to us. Our military lies to us. The old men of poetry and politics have lied to us. The poet has overturned the base assumption about war's honor, that war should not be glorified. War is actually horrible and tragic. Finally, in the old days, war could be glorified and duty and country were honorable entities to fight for, or at least that's what most people thought. This was all before media could show the horrendous implications of war. And World War I was the first war where we actually saw the horrors of what happened on the battlefield. We do have some photographs of the Civil War, but not in the same capacity as we do in World War I. The final ideas about this poem suggest that war is horrendous. It is not sweet and fitting to die for one's country. And so the phrase therefore becomes ironic in the eyes and in the writing of Wilfred Owen. This was a very powerful poem, perhaps hard to get through and hard to listen to, but also very important and I think very well done. It is a rhymed poem, it's rhythmic, and the way that he chooses words is apt. It's one of the best poems, I think, for imagery, rhyme, alliteration, and picking the precise words to fit what Owen is attempting to tell us. Okay, that's all for this poem. Thanks. See you later. Bye-bye.